Non-alcoholic beer is more popular than ever, but making NA beer at home ain't so easy. So when I was challenged by this guy, Dan, you might know him as Hops and Gnarly, to make a non-alcoholic sour beer, I was pretty nervous. Not only have I never made an NA beer, but I've never made a sour beer either. Will I completely fail? Will I be able to satisfy the man who has Gnarly in his name? Stick around to find out. I'm Trent Mouchot, and this is The Brew Show. Let's brew a sour NA beer. Okay, so we're gonna need a plan. Step 1, figure out how to brew a sour beer. There are a bunch of ways to do it, but we have to swap beers in a few weeks, so it has to be quick. Sounds like kettle souring is the way to go. Step 2, brew a non-alcoholic beer. Easier said than done, especially making one with flavor and body that can be severely lacking, like in many commercial NA beers. And step 3, send the beer to Dan and get the final judgment. As someone who doesn't brew a lot of sours, I'm really hoping to not mess this one up and ruin a potential new friendship. Alright, so there's the plan. Let's get going. If you've never made a sour beer before, like me, here's a quick primer on what I learned about homebrewing sours. Many traditional sour styles take a long time, sometimes months, up to years to get the right amount of sourness and funk desired. They can be made using various bacteria or yeast like Brettanomyces, Lactobacillus, and Pediococcus. I just like saying that last one. And when you use these unique microbes, they tend to really get into your gear, making brewing with them in the future a risk for unwanted infection. That's why you'll rarely ever see a brewery making traditional sours alongside normal beers, and why some homebrewers will have dedicated equipment just for those funky ferments. However, there is an alternative to this mixed fermentation method, and that is kettle souring, which is where you pitch a fast-acting bacteria like Lactobacillus into your kettle and allow it to pre-sour your wort. This can take anywhere from 24 to 72 hours. Then once the right level is achieved, you heat the wort up to a boil to pasteurize it, killing off the lacto that can contaminate your gear, but keeping the sourness intact. Apparently traditional brewers kind of look down on this method, but it's a great way for beginners to get into sour beer brewing. So we're going for it. Now making a non-alcoholic beer is a bit tougher, especially a good one. We've all tasted what a bad NA can be. Let's try and do better. There are many methods used, from vacuum boiling to evaporate alcohol, to using yeast that won't consume all the sugars, to brewing a smaller grain bill. Each one has their pros and cons, but in my mind for home brewing, attempting to create a low starting gravity and a high final gravity is the way to go. In the mash, we can use some tricks to create a low ABV beer. First is by using less malt, but not going so light that we lack any flavor or body, and also using adjuncts that improve body, like flaked oats or wheat. Then mash temp can be a lever to tweak. By mashing on the higher range, around 158 or more, we'll extract longer chain sugars, which means less fermentable sugars and a higher potential final gravity. Starting low and ending high. That's my plan to get a low ABV, but we'll see if that all goes according to plan. When Dan and I first met up to discuss this crazy experiment, we each brought an example beer for the other person to be inspired by. If you want to know what kind of beer I gave Dan to replicate, you'll have to check out his video, but it might be even tougher than this one. His beer for me was a Florida Weisse by Untitled Art, a fruited sour that has a strong tang and prominent passion fruit flavor. Florida Weisse is a newer style of beer, much like the Berliner Weisse, but as you might guess, it has a buttload of fruit, usually in the form of puree. It's honestly extremely tasty, so kudos to Untitled Art. But finding more info on the beer beyond that is a challenge. The can and the website have no info about malts, hops, or yeast, except for the fact that they use passionfruit puree, which actually helps me out a bit. By adding fruit juice to the finished beer, I can actually knock back the ABV, as long as I stabilize the beer first, so it doesn't re-ferment, which all those extra sugars will help with body and mouthfeel. Or at least, I hope. So with the rough plan in mind, I got to brewing. A quick thank you to the partners that support this channel. Northern Brewer for providing all the ingredients, and who have one of the largest selections of home brewing ingredients on the internet. Clawhammer Supply, who made the 120 volt 10 gallon system that I'll be brewing on today, and that will help me kettle sour this beer later on. And lastly, Hanna Instruments, but more on them in a little bit. Since I have no idea what I'm doing, I'll be brewing a small batch, 2 gallons, and I'll give you some rough amounts here, but as you'll see, there are some things I would change. Luckily, with the amount of water we needed, there's just enough to cover the heating element and infuse all the grains in the basket. Speaking of grains, I went for a grain bill of 36% Pilsner, 55% Flaked Wheat, and 9% Caramunich. My thoughts were that the Pilsner would give us the fermentables, the wheat would give us the body, and the Caramunich would give us flavor. But as you see here, this is a baby grain bill. Definitely the smallest I've ever used. I crushed the grains and then mashed them at 158 Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. I'm aiming for original gravity of about 1.012. After the mash timer went off, I pulled the grains and brought the wort to a quick 5-minute boil, just to kill off any lactobacillus or other bacteria that may be present from the grains, so that I can sour this to my preferred taste. I then chilled it down to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. For that bacteria, I decided to use Goodbelly probiotic juice. This one just so happens to be passionfruit flavor, although it's unlikely that any of that flavor will carry over. Goodbelly is made with lactobacillus, just the little bug we need to make this sour. Before adding the Goodbelly, I pre-acidified the wort down to a pH of 4.3 using lactic acid. This will help with any potential infections outside of the stuff we're adding, and it gets us off to a head start. And then I added about 5 ounces of the Goodbelly. According to Milk the Funk and other sources, it can be a good idea to purge the headspace with CO2, since oxygen can be bad for lactoferments. Finally, I added the lid and sealed up the edge with some plastic wrap to keep any bad bugs out. The reason you might need an electric system like the claw hammer or any other is because we need to keep the temp between 80 degrees Fahrenheit and 100 degrees Fahrenheit for the lacto to do its job properly. So if you don't have an e-system like that, you might just need to use a heat wrap or something to keep it warm. You see, after I add the Goodbelly, the lactobacillus will get to work, reproducing and consuming sugars to create lactic acid, which will make it sour. This can take anywhere from half a day to almost a week, and the best way to measure how sour the wort is by taking pH readings, which the pH meter from Hanna Instruments, the sponsor of this portion of the video, does extremely well. This is their Halo 2 pH meter, and it's one of the most high-tech and feature-rich pH meters I've ever used. Not only is it extremely accurate and simple to calibrate, but it has a wireless app that you can log and track your readings, which can be quite helpful if you're taking a bunch of readings like I am for this kettle sour. And if you don't want to use the app, you can just drop it in a sample and get an instant reading. I've said in the past that cheap pH meters are a dime a dozen online, and making an investment in a quality pH meter will go a long way. So if you're in the market for a solid one, then be sure to check out the link in the description and use the code BREW10 when checking out for 10% off your order. So back at the kettle, I just let it sit, and every 12 hours or so would take a pH reading to see how the pH was falling. My goal was to get to a pH of 3.5, which took about 56 hours to finally get there. At which point I removed the plastic wrap and brought the wort to a boil. The boil will not only pasteurize the wort, but it'll give me a chance to add a hop for bitterness. Yeah, you heard that right, I said hop, because I'm literally throwing in 1 pellet of Cascade. That's it. Not looking for much bitterness or flavor here, it's all about the sour. I let it boil for 15 minutes and then cool down to around 69 Fahrenheit. For the main fermentation, I'll be using WLP 029 German Ale Kolsch yeast. I pitched it and let this baby ferment for a couple of days. And that's really all it took, since the OG was so small. The final gravity did go a bit farther than expected, 1.004, which meant this beer ended up at about 1% ABV. And that actually ended up being okay, because I'm about to add some juice and dilute this down. But before we add the juice, we need to stabilize the beer, basically putting all the remaining yeast to bed so they won't wake up and re-ferment once I add more sugary juice. The best combo is a Campden tablet plus potassium sorbate. I dosed it for 1 gallon and added it to the keg, and then racked the beer onto it. I'm just racking in 1 gallon since I'll be adding about a gallon of juice on the next day. The rest of the 1% sour will be drank up, don't worry. The next day it was time to add the juice. Finally. Now technically, Florida Vista specifically says to use puree, but my local grocery store had this passionfruit juice, so that was good enough for me. I also got a guava thing on the Untitled Art beer, so I decided to add some of that as well. I just opened up the lid of the keg and dumped in all the juice, and it was smelling phenomenal. At that moment, I kind of realized an issue. Since I added the juice, it did help dilute the 1% down to below 0.5%, the legal limit that can be considered non-alcoholic in the US. But what I didn't account for was how all that sugar would impact the apparent tartness or sourness of the beer, which it certainly did. This tasted like straight up juice. So I decided to add some lactic acid to bring down the pH back to around 3 and give the beer more of a zip. The last step was to carb it up and send it off. But did it work? Is it even sour still? Will Dan spit it out in my face via a computer screen from hundreds of miles away? All I could do was package it up and send it his way to hear from the gnarly man himself.
So we got the Florida Vice. Ooh, it smells good.
Yeah, let me tell you a little bit about it.
Yeah, please do. I'm going to pour some.
I have never done a sour before. This is my first sour, and I've never done non-alcoholic. So you threw a real curveball at me. So
love it.
What I basically did was I went for like kettle sour. And I kept the ABV, or at least the starting gravity, really low. I ended up getting like a 1% beer. I kettle soured with Goodbelly, and
Sick.
Yeah, it was an experience because I've never done it. So I was watching some of the videos you've done and other people like,
Nice.
how do I do this?
Well, I got a nice little like spritz of carbonation when I popped it. I can see there's definitely some bubbles in there.
Mm-hmm.
And the aroma is like, it reminds me of almost like a fruit cup to some extent.
Right.
Definitely something tropical. Passion fruit.
I went with passion fruit juice. And
Ooh.
so what I actually did was I stabilized. I used potassium sorbate and metabisulfite to stop the yeast. So when I add the juice, it didn't re-ferment.
Yep.
And that kept a lot of the sweetness and I think keeps a lot of that fruit flavor and aroma intact.
Probably some body too. I'm gonna go in for a taste.
Cheers.
Oh, buddy. Yum. You get some of that. It's like that sweetness from the juice fills the body out a little bit more. So I did a beer recently where I tried to do the same thing and kill the yeast before putting the fruit puree in there.
Mm-hmm.
And I just used, I think it was potassium metabisulfite only.
Right.
And it didn't work. Like either I didn't use enough, or I think what you did is the way to do it. You got to use both.
Yeah. So like the metabisulfite will basically like knock them out. Like they'll go to sleep for like a little bit, but eventually they'll come back. So if you use like sorbate with it, it kind of like really keeps it suppressed and not start back up.
The body for 1%, like, geez.
It has like a little bit of like a tartness.
No,
I guess.
yeah. I think it matches like the fruit. Like it's not overpowering. It's definitely not like sometimes when I have a beer that's just a fruit beer that's not sour, it just seems off to me because like the acidity doesn't match the fruit that you're like thinking of or comparing it to. You know what I mean? This is right in line. Nice work, man.
Thanks.
For the first NA and first sour.
Thanks to you for the challenge. I mean, it definitely got me excited to try like more like sours because it was always like something completely unknown to me and to dip my toes in. Also, the non-alcoholic. I can't wait to try like different things and try different ways of producing a non-alcoholic. But yeah, this was fun. So in the end, he liked it, or at least he was nice enough to say so. It was definitely a blast working with him on this project, and he really threw me through a loop with that one. But that was the best part of it, trying something completely new and out of my normal realm. And that's how you grow and learn to be a better brewer. I know I learned a lot from this. So go out and brew something completely crazy, something you've never tried before, and let me know how it turns out. I'll guarantee you'll learn something from it too. Big thank you to Dan of Hops and Gnarly. If you don't know about his channel, go check it out. He makes excellent videos and brews a lot of unique stuff, including some other non-alcoholic beers and other sours. And if you want to see the NA beer I challenged him with, then click on this video right now.